Disclaimer: this content is intended for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is advised. Sometimes life puts us in situations we never imagine ourselves being in, moments that blur the line between what feels right and what feels wrong. This story is one of those moments. It's about a choice made in the heat of an evening, about two people under the same roof whose lives suddenly collided in a way that neither expected. The title says it all. I agreed to share a bed with my stepson and could not say no. But behind those words is a much deeper story filled with emotions, silence, hesitation, and choices that changed everything. It all began as something innocent, two adults simply trying to make the best out of an awkward situation. A late night, a house that felt too big and too quiet, and a bed that suddenly didn't seem like such a big deal to share. But what happens when boundaries are tested? What happens when comfort begins to feel like temptation? That's what makes this story worth telling. Because sometimes the things we promise ourselves we'll never do are the very things that find a way to happen. She was in her early 40s, confident, beautiful, but also vulnerable in ways she never liked to admit. He was in his mid-20s, mature for his age, independent, and carrying his own quiet strength. They weren't strangers, not really, but they weren't supposed to be this close either. And yet, one night changed the way they looked at each other. What started with small conversations and long glances suddenly became something neither of them could easily explain. You might wonder, how does someone even find themselves in this position? Was it loneliness? Was it curiosity? Or maybe it was just the way human hearts sometimes ignore the rules when emotions run too deep. That's the question I want you to think about as you listen to this story. Would you have done the same? Or would you have walked away before it got complicated? As the night unfolded, what seemed harmless grew heavier with every minute. The air felt warmer, silence grew louder, and both of them realized there was something unspoken in the space between them. It wasn't just about sharing a bed anymore. It was about sharing thoughts, secrets, and desires they never dared say out loud. And yet, once the line was crossed, there was no way to pretend nothing had happened. This story isn't just about infidelity. It's about human choices, the fragile balance between love and loyalty, and the way moments of weakness can leave us questioning everything we thought we knew about ourselves. It asks the question, is it possible to care deeply for someone and still betray another? And more importantly, what happens after? Before we dive deeper into the events of that night, I want to hear from you. If you were in a situation where sharing a bed seemed harmless but carried hidden risks, what would you do? Would you trust yourself to keep the boundaries, or would you be tempted to cross them? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and take part in the poll pinned at the top of this video. The night she agreed to share that bed was not just another night, it carried the weight of everything that had happened before. To understand why it felt so heavy, you have to know the silence that lingered in the house and the way life had quietly pushed them closer together. She had been living alone for a while, filling her days with routine, work, and small joys that barely covered the loneliness that crept in once the sun went down. He had moved back into the house only a few weeks before, bringing with him an energy that both comforted and unsettled her. At first, their interactions were simple. Casual talks in the kitchen, light jokes when they passed in the hallway, and moments at the dinner table where their eyes would meet a second longer than usual. He was older now, not the boy she remembered from years ago, but a grown man, independent, calm, and carrying himself with a confidence that was hard to ignore. She noticed those changes, though she never admitted it out loud. He noticed her too, though he hid it behind polite words and small gestures that spoke louder than anything he ever said. That night, the house was colder than usual, and the storm outside made it worse. The guest room heater had stopped working, and without much thought, he asked if it would be all right to share her bed for the night. It sounded practical, innocent even, but in the silence that followed, her heart skipped. A part of her wanted to refuse, to avoid what she already felt stirring inside, but another part of her didn't want to be alone anymore. And so, she agreed. Lying side by side in the dark, every sound became sharper, the ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the storm, the rhythm of their breathing. She tried to close her eyes, to pretend nothing had changed, but she was too aware of him being there. The warmth of another presence so close after so many quiet nights was both comforting and unsettling. Every inch of space between them felt charged, as though something invisible was waiting to be spoken or acted on. She found herself replaying moments in her head, the time he had helped her carry groceries and brushed against her hand, the way he had laughed at something she said and looked at her with an expression that stayed with her long after. None of it had seemed important then, but lying there now, all those small moments felt like pieces of something larger she had been avoiding. He wasn't asleep either. She could feel the shift of the mattress whenever he turned, as if he too was wrestling with thoughts he couldn't quiet. There was no conversation, only silence heavy with meaning. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he felt the same conflict she did. Did he notice her heartbeat quicken when the space between them closed? Did he remember those glances across the room the way she did? The night stretched on, every minute carrying the weight of what might happen next. She knew she should keep the boundary, remind herself of the reasons it wasn't right. But another voice in her mind whispered about loneliness, about the comfort of connection, about how easy it was to let one small choice change everything. And so, they stayed in that quiet tension, both awake, both waiting, though neither would admit it. It was as if the storm outside had found its way inside the room, filling the air with a restless energy they couldn't escape. And by the time morning light would creep through the curtains, nothing between them would ever feel the same again. Morning came, but it didn't erase the weight of the night before. The storm had cleared, yet inside the house, the silence was thicker than ever. She woke first, lying perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid he might open his eyes and read every thought she had tried so hard to bury. The truth was, she hadn't slept at all. Every second of the night had been spent in restless awareness of his presence, his breathing, the warmth radiating from him in the small space they shared. When he finally stirred, their eyes met, just for a second too long. He smiled lightly, casual, almost as if nothing unusual had happened. But she could see it, something lingered in his gaze. Something unspoken. She answered with a smile of her own, though it felt fragile, like glass ready to crack. They got up, made coffee, and talked about small things: the weather, the day ahead, the repairs needed for the heater in the guest room. But beneath those words, tension simmered. It was like an invisible thread pulling them closer even as they tried to keep their distance. As days passed, small changes crept into their routine. He began spending more time in the kitchen, staying up later at the dining table, or lingering near the living room while she watched television. Conversations that used to be short now stretched longer, drifting into personal territory, dreams, regrets, and the loneliness they both carried. She started noticing the details of him she had ignored before, the way his voice softened when he spoke of his future, the way he listened without interrupting, and the way he looked at her as though he saw past every mask she wore. The conflict grew not in arguments, but in silences. She told herself to be careful, to keep the boundaries clear, but with each shared moment, those boundaries blurred. The house that once felt too big now seemed to shrink around them, forcing them into closeness she couldn't avoid. She wondered if he felt it too, or if it was just her imagination painting meaning onto moments that should have been ordinary. One evening, while cleaning up after dinner, their hands brushed when they both reached for the same plate. It was nothing more than a fleeting touch, yet her chest tightened as though the air had shifted. He pulled back quickly, giving a half smile, but the look in his eyes told her he had felt it too. She carried that moment with her all night, questioning what it meant and what might happen if either of them dared to cross the line. The real conflict wasn't just about them, it was also about what others might think, what it could mean if the truth ever came out. She imagined the whispers, the judgment, the disappointment. And yet, every time she tried to picture pulling away, her heart ached. Was it wrong to want connection, even if it came from the most complicated place? Or was it simply human nature to crave closeness when loneliness had stretched too long? He, too, seemed caught between restraint and something deeper. Sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, his expression unreadable. Other times, he distanced himself, keeping his words short as though he feared saying too much. The push and pull only added to the suspense between them, leaving her restless and uncertain. This is where the story truly begins to deepen. The conflict is no longer just about sharing a bed that night. It's about the feelings that followed, the quiet choices that built upon one another, and the weight of secrets neither of them dared to voice. The days that followed only tightened the invisible thread between them. What started as glances and silences had grown into something far more undeniable. Every ordinary moment seemed laced with meaning. The simple act of sitting across from each other at the dinner table felt like a test, every word heavy with things unsaid. She caught herself studying him too long, noticing the curve of his smile, the way his voice softened when he said her name. And every time she looked away, her heart reminded her of the storm she was trying so hard to ignore. One night, the power went out again. Darkness filled the house, broken only by the faint glow of candles on the kitchen counter. They sat together, the shadows flickering across their faces, their conversation falling into long pauses. The silence felt alive, pressing down on them until even the smallest breath seemed loud. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady, as if he was waiting for her to say something she couldn't find the courage to speak. She gripped her glass of water, pretending to be calm, though inside, everything was unraveling. The conflict had reached a point where pretending no longer worked. Every time they brushed past each other in the hallway, every time their laughter lingered longer than it should, the line blurred more. It wasn't just about one night in the same bed anymore, it was about the pull that had been building since then, a pull neither of them could escape. Later that evening, when the storm outside grew louder, they found themselves in the living room. The rain pounded against the windows, thunder echoing in the distance. She wrapped a blanket around herself, but the cold wasn't the reason she shivered. He sat beside her, close enough that the warmth of his arm brushed against hers. They didn't speak, and yet the silence was filled with words neither dared to say. Her thoughts raced. What if someone found out? What if this moment defined everything that came after? And still, there was a deeper question burning in her mind. What if she didn't stop it? What if she let the night unfold the way it seemed destined to? The weight of that choice pressed down on her, making her chest tighten. He shifted slightly, turning toward her. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the world outside seemed to fade. The storm, the darkness, the fear, none of it mattered as much as the moment hanging between them. It was as if time itself held its breath, waiting to see who would make the first move. And that's where the story stands on edge. Suspense, tension, and the weight of unspoken desire all tangled into one moment. The question now is not if something will happen, but when. And when it does, what will it mean for them both? The storm outside finally began to fade, but inside the house the air was still heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Just when it seemed like the night would break under the weight of everything left unsaid, something unexpected happened that shifted the story in a way neither of them could have predicted. The phone rang. Its sharp tone cut through the silence, startling them both. She reached for it quickly, grateful for the distraction, but also nervous about who might be on the other end. It was her close friend, someone who hadn't called in months. Their conversation was light at first, full of catching up, but it didn't take long before the friend asked about him, how he was doing, what it was like having him back in the house. The question hit harder than it should have. She found herself fumbling for words, her eyes flicking toward him as if he could hear the other side of the call. There was no reason for her to feel guilty, and yet she did. That simple question planted a new seed of fear. If her friend was curious, how many others might be? If anyone looked too closely, would they notice the change in the air? When the call ended, he was still watching her. His expression was calm, but there was something sharp in his gaze, something that made her heart race. It was as if he understood the weight of that phone call, as if he knew that the outside world, friends, family, expectations, was the one thing strong enough to pull them apart. The conflict was no longer just between them and their emotions. It was about the risk of being discovered, about how fragile their secret really was. The next few days carried a different energy. She found herself more guarded, trying to act normal, while he seemed more determined to break through the walls she was quickly rebuilding. He began helping her more around the house, insisting on joining her for errands, and always finding small excuses to be near her. It was sweet, thoughtful even, but underneath it all she felt the pressure building. The closeness was no longer private, it was starting to bleed into the open, into parts of life where it could no longer be hidden. Then came another twist that caught her off guard. One evening, while she was making dinner, he casually mentioned that he had been offered a new opportunity out of state. It wasn't certain yet, but it was big, and it could change his future. The words hit her like a wave. For weeks, she had been torn between resisting him and falling into something she couldn't control. Now the possibility of him leaving made her realize just how much she had already let him in. The thought of losing him stirred a panic she hadn't expected. This revelation raised the stakes higher than ever. The conflict wasn't only about whether to act on their feelings, it was also about time. If he left, would this silent pull between them vanish unspoken, or would it drive them to finally cross the line before it was too late? The ticking clock made every glance, every word, every brush of the hand feel more urgent. She lay awake that night replaying his words. Out of state. Opportunity. Future. Each word echoed like a countdown. If she stayed silent, she might never know what could have been. But if she spoke, if she let him know the truth, she risked not only judgment but her own heart. The tension had never been higher. The storm outside had passed, but inside the house, a much bigger one was beginning to form. And now, the question wasn't just whether they would cross the line, but whether they could face what would come after. The night of the decision came quietly, without warning. The air in the house felt different, heavier somehow, as if both of them knew this was the moment that would decide everything. She had tried to distract herself all day, but his words about leaving replayed in her mind over and over. Out of state. Opportunity. Future. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that staying silent was no longer an option. If she let him go without saying anything, she would carry that silence with her forever. He found her in the living room, sitting in the glow of a single lamp. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her as though memorizing the sight. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the same battle she had been fighting herself. When he finally sat beside her, the silence stretched so long it almost hurt. Then, with a quiet breath, she whispered the words she had been holding back. I don't want you to go. The confession hung between them, fragile and trembling, but once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. His expression softened, and he admitted what she had always suspected, that he had felt the same pull, the same tension, every single day since that night. The walls they had built crumbled in an instant, replaced by honesty and the weight of what it meant. They both knew the risks, the consequences, but in that moment, none of it mattered more than the truth. The climax of their story was not in dramatic actions, but in the raw honesty of that moment. The silence that had haunted them for weeks was finally broken, and with it came a mix of relief and fear. They held each other, not knowing what the future would bring, only knowing that pretending any longer was impossible. But just when it seemed they had crossed the final line, the unexpected twist arrived. His phone buzzed on the table, and when he answered, his face changed. It was the company that had offered him the out-of-state job, confirming that everything was set, and they wanted him to start sooner than expected. The reality hit them both at once. Their confession had come at the very edge of goodbye. Instead of ending their story neatly, the twist left them with a new conflict. They had finally admitted their feelings, only to be faced with the possibility of being separated before anything could truly begin. The suspense wasn't about whether they cared for each other anymore. It was about whether they would fight for what they had just discovered, or let time and distance steal it away. And so the climax left them, and us, with one final question. When the chance for love comes at the wrong time, do you hold on no matter the cost, or let it go and wonder forever what might have been? The call that night changed everything. What should have been a moment of peace after their confession turned into a reminder of how fragile time really was. The confirmation of his new job hung over them like a shadow. She tried to hide the worry in her face, but he noticed. He always noticed. He reached for her hand, holding it with a quiet steadiness, as if to say that distance didn't have to mean the end. Yet neither of them could ignore the truth. Life was about to pull them in different directions. The days that followed were bittersweet. Instead of drifting around each other like they had before, they now leaned into their closeness, speaking openly, laughing without restraint, and savoring every ordinary moment. Trips to the grocery store, late-night talks over coffee, even folding laundry together. Everything carried new weight because they both knew the clock was ticking. The silence that had once been filled with tension was now filled with meaning. They no longer questioned the connection between them. They only questioned what would happen once he left. In quiet moments, she wondered if this was how life worked, that sometimes love came at the wrong time, with the wrong person, but in the right way to change you forever. He wondered too, asking her if she thought they would regret this path or cherish it. She couldn't answer with certainty, and neither could he, but the one thing they agreed on was that ignoring their feelings would have been the real mistake. On the morning of his departure, the house felt different again, almost hollow. They sat together in the kitchen, the same place where so much of their story had unfolded, and exchanged the kind of goodbye that wasn't really goodbye. He promised to call, she promised to visit, and though they both knew the road ahead would be complicated, they also knew their bond wasn't something distance could easily erase. The resolution wasn't neat, but it was real. They chose honesty over silence, connection over denial, and possibility over regret. Their story wasn't about forbidden choices. It was about how loneliness, timing, and unspoken feelings can shape our lives in ways we never expect. It left them with scars and questions, but also with memories they would never trade for anything. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Sometimes life doesn't hand us perfect endings. Sometimes it gives us complicated ones, endings that test our courage to be honest with ourselves and with the people who matter most. The story of sharing a bed that night was only the beginning of something bigger, a reminder that love doesn't always follow rules, and the hardest choices are the ones that teach us the most. Now I want to ask you, do you think they should fight for this connection despite the challenges, or should they have let it end quietly when he left? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to see a sequel that explores what happens when distance and time test their bond, let me know. Summary. This is the true story of two adults drawn together by loneliness and unspoken feelings, a connection that began innocently but grew into something neither of them could ignore. Through tension, silence, and unexpected twists, they are forced to face the conflict between desire, timing, and choices that could change everything. In the end, they find honesty in the most complicated of circumstances, leaving behind a story that lingers long after the last word.